Name is Giulia Carsaniga, and today I will facilitate this session on behalf of data.europa.eu team. Before going through our agenda for today, let me remind you of some rules of the game. So as you can see, and as you have also read in our invitation, this is a recorded webinar. The recording of the webinar will be made available to you on data.europa.eu after this session. We will remind you also via email. A second and third important rule, please, if you can, throughout the webinar, switch off your camera and your microphone so that our presenters can smoothly present without being interrupted. Of course, if you have any questions or comments, you can use the chat, and me and my colleagues, we will make sure to have a look at the chat and address your comments and questions right away or during our Q&A later. So here is our agenda for today. The first point is a brief introduction on the topic of measuring open data impact on my side. I will provide some examples of measurement methods used at European level, leveraging especially our experience at data.europa.eu. This will then set the stage for zooming into the experience of countries in Europe. So it is when I will give the floor to our two speakers of today, Joanna and Antonin, who I will introduce better later, and who will share with us their experiences from their countries, namely Poland and France. Following these presentations, we will have a panel discussion that will be moderated by my colleague in data.europa.eu, David, who I will also introduce later. And finally, we will have some time for Q&A and feedback. Okay, so if we are all on board, we can start with introducing the topic of today, measuring open data impact. And I think a very good way of starting this is to ask ourselves, even before talking about measuring approaches, is why should we measure impact at all, and why should we measure the impact of open data? By definition, measuring impact is a good way of providing understanding of both the positive and negative effects of an intervention in a single or in multiple domains. In this regard, as some of you might know, in 2021, the European Commission published its Better Regulation Guidelines and Better Regulation Toolbox, which address the need for impact assessments measuring impact to promote informed decision-making and to contribute to a better kind of regulation, so regulation that delivers full benefits at a minimum cost and is in line with the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality of the EU law. What does it mean for the open data field? Well, in the case of open data, we can see how impact assessments are being relevant, for example, to provide insights into the effectiveness of open data portals, into the usefulness or impactfulness, indeed, of some data sets over others, and also into the externalities and benefits that the reuse of open data can have on a broader public. On the other hand, following the definition of the Better Regulation Guidelines, we can see how measuring impact of open data is a worthwhile exercise in view of the Open Data Directive that entered into force in 2018 and the soon-to-be published Implementing Act on High-Value Datasets, for which consultation ended in June. But before being able to measure impact, we also need to think, what is impact? What is the definition of impact of open data? Impact can be created in very different ways, in very different domains, which makes per se the task of measuring impact already very challenging. This is even truer when it comes to data that is open and freely available for reuse by everyone. This is therefore no surprise that now we don't have a consistent definition of open data impact in Europe. However, some of the articles that we have been reviewing and that look at the impact of open data refer to open data impact in positive terms as all the benefits of using and reusing open data for citizens, society, economy. These articles also often refer to the approaches and the definitions used by two existing open data frameworks, which are the Open Data Barometer on the one hand and the Open Data Maturity on the other. The Open Data Barometer is an exercise that has been conducted by World Wide Web Foundation and Omidyar Network every year until 2018. And its goal was to assess how governments are publishing and using open data for having an impact on accountability, innovation, social impact. And it involved 30 countries worldwide. The Open Data Maturity, some of you may already know it, is our portal data.europa.eu yearly publication to compare more than 30 European countries' level of open data maturity. So not only EU member states, but also EFTA countries and neighboring countries, along 4 dimensions, which are the policy of open data portals, the quality of the open data that is published, and also impact of open data. This impact is regarded in the ODM, in the open data maturity, from a political, social, environmental, and economic perspective. These are the 4 areas of impact considered. But let me spend a bit more time on the open data maturity assessment, as this year we have reviewed the methodology, and in particular we have restructured the open data impact dimension. Why we have done that? Well, on the one hand, we wanted to better acknowledge that assessing open data impact is still a challenge for many countries in Europe. As we have just said, there is no consistent definition and no single approach to measuring this impact. At the same time, we also wanted to better distinguish 2 elements of this impact assessment, which is measuring the reuse of open data and measuring the impact that is created through this reuse. This is why our dimension, impact dimension in the open data maturity now is made up of 3 sub-dimensions. We have the strategic awareness one, which was a sub-dimension already used for previous editions, and which evaluates how important it is for countries responding to our questionnaire to measure the level of reuse and the impact of open data. So a bit like the first question that we just asked in this introduction, why measuring reuse and impact? The second and third sub-dimensions are, as mentioned, measuring reuse and creating impact. To be more specific, the measuring reuse sub-dimension looks at the ways in which countries analyze reuse. So here you can find questions related to whether countries are tracking their data sets, whether they have a systematic ways of collecting reuse cases. On the other hand, created impact sub-dimension looks at how impact from reuse is measured in all of the 4 impact dimensions that I mentioned before, so governmental, social, environmental, and economic dimension. To do so, we have a 2-step approach. So first, we ask, for example, in the case of a governmental impact, whether country has been measuring the impact of open data reuse in this area of impact, and whether there is evidence and data about it, for example, in the form of a report or an analysis. In a second step, we then deep dive into specific challenges related to the impact area. For example, in the case of social impact, we ask if the reuse of open data in that area had an impact in better including marginalized groups in the society. So what is important to retain here is that this specific subdimension tries really not just to list reuse cases, but to ask countries whether these reuse cases are having an impact and how, and to explain how these is happening. So not just a listing exercise, but really trying to understand how impact is created. Besides the open data maturity and the open data barometer, there are, of course, also other approaches that try to improve impact assessment in Europe and globally. For example, the OECD Open Government Data Project or the taxonomy developed by Verhulst and Young, specifically for developing countries. From the perspective, again, of our portal of data.europa.eu, we are also taking some steps towards standardized methodology. And these steps are, for example, on the one hand, the literature review that we have recently conducted, reviewing existing impact frameworks. And this review will be published soon. And on the other hand, a research project that monitors 30 reuse cases of open data over the course of 3 years, from 2022 to 2025. This research project is called the Use Case Observatory and will include the publication of 3 reports, one of which will be published very soon in October, and will introduce the 30 reuse cases that we have interviewed and which you can see also on the slide, divided according to the different impact areas. In this first report, we also try to delineate the impact that these reuse cases have at the moment of writing right now. And we expect for the report 2 and report 3 that will be published later in 2024 and 2025 to be able to focus more on the development from one year to another in terms of their impact. What is already clear, however, from the first report is that measuring open data impact is not an easy task, as already said, not for the reuse cases per se, which often have troubles understanding which approach to use to measure the impact of their services, and also not from our perspective, as sometimes some reuse cases could not or were not willing to share some informations, for example, regarding number of clients or some financial information, for the fear of getting into a disadvantage with respect to competitors who might retrieve this information. So here I'm talking specifically about, for instance, SMEs, and maybe not about an NGO or a foundation. I will not disclose more than that, however, regarding the results, because as you can see on the slide, we plan to have a webinar about this specific report. And we will invite also 4 of our 30 reuse cases to give their experience, to share with us their experience. The webinar will take place on the 7th of October, and I will make sure to send in the chat also the link for registration in case some of you is interested to join. So after talking about European and global efforts to measure open data impact, I think it's now time to turn the page into the experience of singular countries in Europe, which means that I will introduce now our first speaker for today, who will share the experience of Poland. Joanna Malczewska, Counselor for the Data Management Department of Poland's Chancellery of the Prime Minister. Hi, Joanna. Thank you very much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia, and welcome, everybody. Well, in my presentation, I would like to focus, as the title says, on a very practical approach that comes directly from our experience and lessons learned. And I was told that the presentation is to be short, so I'll try to be brief. But I'm sure that some topics may be further discussed during the panel if they are of interest to all of you. Can I have the next slide, please? The idea to create an objective impact, or rather objective impact assessment criteria appeared roughly 2 years ago when we were preparing a cross-sectoral survey of entrepreneurs, and this survey was supposed to cover a number of aspects concerning open data in business, a multidimensional study, but our main aim was to assess the size and characteristics of the open data market in the enterprise sector. But early on, we decided that surely some of the indicators would also refer to the impact assessment. Can I have the next slide, please, Julia? Thank you. And here you can see the 4 impact assessment parameters that we came up with. And they examine in turn, firstly, what is the business's level of interest in open data. Secondly, we are curious if open data is seen as opportunity by businesses. Do they see it as useful for development, for innovation, for growing? Thirdly, the third parameter refers to the market trends. It helps to gain knowledge what are the market trends in open data. In other words, which data and from which thematic areas may be in demand in future. And lastly, the fourth is what business sectors and business solutions can be impacted the most by access to the open data. And these 4 indicators were used in quantitative study on enterprises. We sampled 600 micro, small, medium, and large enterprises from different regions, covering different market sectors and different different areas of activities. And as far as we talk about the parameters, the results were very satisfactory. We find them useful and successfully applied to the enterprises. And well, it was a pilot survey and quite a good base for further application. Next slide, please. As I said or indicated, the basic idea was to use these indicators, the 4 parameters, of course, with some modifications and after further tests to measure the impact of open data on various aspects related to economic and social dimensions of various groups, specific sectors, or even society as such. Next slide, please. And well, this is to illustrate how we were thinking. Well, because after a pilot survey of entrepreneurs, we applied the indicators to the next sector last year. It was smart farming, again with very promising results. And doing the research on agri-producers, we found out that the parameters work well when evaluating not only the broad range of entrepreneurs from different sectors, the cross-sectoral sample, but they work quite all right applied to a more sector-specific group of entrepreneurs like agri-producers. So we decided to move on, and there are the new challenges ahead of us, and I'm referring to the 2 next surveys we are planning, and at the moment our research team is starting to develop a tool for researching local governments, which is scheduled for the next year. It'll be is scheduled to the end of this year, but the process will continue, and the real test for us and for our indicators will be the NGO survey, which is planned for 2023. And at the moment, frankly speaking, it's quite hard for me to say how our indicators will work out in this new, so to speak, environment, and how well they will adapt to extreme conditions, because the NGO survey will be the first quality survey for us. So we'll try to apply these parameters to quality survey and to quite limited respondent groups. So it'll be extreme, but we do hope that early study of local governments will bring us some useful outcomes and some findings regarding the methodology. And the next slide, please. Well, yeah, this slide is so to say, an outlet for our frustration after quite unsuccessful attempts to commission the survey to the external contractors. The starting point and the turning point at the same time was our unsuccessful survey of state-owned enterprises last year. We try to analyze, we try to study how our parameters were applied to public sector. So after measuring economic impact within the private environment, we try to do the same. We're researching state-owned enterprises, but well, unfortunately, it didn't work out. To do, frankly speaking, terrible cooperation with the contractor. We were forced to terminate the contract, and there was not enough time to redo the whole exercise. So we quit and had to engage in other projects. But well, we don't have good experience here, and over time we slowly moved away from commissioning surveys in favor of performing them ourselves, and the history is like likewise for entrepreneurs. The first pilot survey we commissioned the entire service from start to finish. But we had big reservations about the research tool that was prepared for us. It was modified numerous times, and at the end of the day, we actually almost completely overwritten it. So it was rather our product than something that was done for us. In smart farming, we commissioned all apart from the research tool, which we constructed ourselves, but still the cooperation with the contractor was problematic, and we had some delays we struggled with. So, one factor is that this instance we had to rely on contractor due to the lack of respondents' contact base. So this is one factor we have to accommodate. But the NGOs and local government surveys we will conduct ourselves from start to finish, and we'll see how it goes. And frankly speaking, I don't know how universal this experience is. Perhaps it's just some local features of the Polish research companies market, or it's perhaps the issue of public procurement law, but in our experience, preparing a tender document that will select a good contractor, even while applying a solid non-pricing criteria, well, it's frankly too difficult, too time-consuming, and the results are unpredictable in the end. So it is really not worth the effort. You fairly sure can rely on your own employees and your own research team if they are available. Can I have the next slide, please? Well, I quite like this infographic because it illustrates my point quite well, that surveys are only one element of the entire ecosystem of open data here in Poland, but in other countries, I'm sure as well. And what I want to say and prove by this picture is that impact assessment study is not an end of itself, because impact is never the only element we investigate in our in the course of our research, because such a limitation of scope would, I believe, be a waste of our finite resources. So impact assessment as a part of a wider study, multidimensional study, allows you to put this impact in a wider context and better diagnose why it is the way it is, what shapes it, what steers in this or that direction, and the results obtained during the research, such multidimensional research, including impact assessment, quite well feed on all other strategic areas and all other elements of this complex environment. And we can modify our priorities, we can create our strategies, adjust our policies better that way on data we obtain that are more complex. And can we move to the next slide, please? Because, well, that's conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention for now, and back to you, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for your presentation. I look forward also to the Q&A and panel discussion later. Yes, so let's move now to our second country presentation, telling us more about the French experience in measuring open data impact. Today is Antonin Garonnet, product owner at French open data portal data.gov.fr. Hi, Antonin. Thank you for being here. Please, you can share your slides.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, very well.
Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for the invitation and for everyone that is here today. So I'll share a few things on the French experience on impact measurement. Just a few words about me in introduction. I work in within ETALab, which is a department in charge of the state data strategy in general, including open data. It is under the Prime Minister authority. And within this department, I work as the product owner of the national portal data.europa.fr, which reference all the French open data. And my job is to define the product vision and prioritize on how to reach this vision. I've put my socials and my mails underneath in case you want to reach out and ask any question after this webinar. So today I'll try to explain a conceptual tool that we use to understand the different levels of open data impact, which is really based on different stages of uses. The more we advance in the level of uses, the more it gets interesting, but also it gets more and more difficult to measure. I'll introduce each level and I'll try to show what we can measure on this level, how we can measure it, the limits of these measurements, and some tips from our experience. I really want to emphasize that this is a complicated issue, and even though the fact that I present different levels might sound like it's very structured, we still haven't figured it all out. It's I think the issue of impact measurements is hard for everyone working on open data by design. So the first level, yes, and I also like to emphasize that this is very much focused on the portal and the product itself, because this is what I do, and rather than on the open data policy in general, which can be even broader. So the first level of usage and on impact measurement would be the very raw data we can get from open data usage. So for example, it can be the number of visits on a data set, the number of data sets that are published on the platform, the number of downloads, for example. So this is very easy to get from your portal metrics. We also publish, for example, our data catalog as a data set itself, so everyone can play with it and make analysis. You get very little information from this because most of those metrics are what we call vanity metrics. Means that it's metrics that you are happy to get, like, oh, I have a lot of visits, but it doesn't mean you produce any impact. It can mean a lot of people are lost on your website, and they come to the national open data platform looking for COVID-19 information, for example, and they don't need raw data, so they just are lost on the platform. It can mean that you have a lot of dataset published, but can mean that you've separate data sets in very small pieces, which is hard to reuse. So those metrics are very hard to play with, and most of the time it's more vanity than really impact. So the tip here are to really measure how the portal works is to set more precise and relevant indicators, and they change according to what you want to measure at a certain time. I've gave here an example, like the average time spent on data previsualization before and after you release a new feature, for example. So it's much more precise indicators, both in time and in the scope of what you want to measure. The second level is direct uses of the data. That's what was present earlier. For example, the number of application, the number of press article, the number of research projects. So those you can measure the number of reuses in general. You can do this by enable users to share their work on the national platform. For example, we have a space where everyone can share their reuses. We try to encourage them to do so, both with business techniques, I'll say, like talking with them, contacting reusers that we know, but also with product enhancement that give incentive and like call to action at the right time to incentive users to share their uses. Here it's important to note that reuses that are referenced on the platform are always the very tip of the iceberg, and you always have to look further to sometimes more difficult to reach stakeholders. Julia already mentioned this with SMEs, that it can be harder to know their usage rather than NGOs and association, etc. We noticed on the portal that we have a very strong representation of non-profit and individuals, and very low representation on private company, for example. So there is a misrepresentation of usage if you just rely on people to by themselves share their works. So the tip here is to learn who and why they reference their work. As I said, we realized analysis on the 3,000 and more reuses that we have on the portal to learn what communities of people sorry, publish their reuses, and also why they reference their reuses, and we learn the different motivation. So this helps us now to try to work on a certain motivation. For example, we learned that sometimes they want to get more views on their reuse. They want to display their talent. They have different motivation, and now we try to play with those motivation to incentivize reuse publishment. As I said, it's important also to look beyond what's published because it's always the tip of the iceberg. And as I said, find way to incentivize users. The third level of impact measurement and of usage is indirect uses. So this is getting more and more difficult to measure. Now it's pretty much as Julia said. After you measure the number of reuses, now you have to measure how those reuses impact the world and how they are important. So the first thing to know is, for example, the number of users of a website, the number of readers of a press article, the number of download of an application. What you can do very easily is to look at the metrics on the portal of the reuses and see how popular they are. But this gives you a little indication because can only show the interest of the reuse on your portal and not in general. So here you really have to just reach to reusers, try to establish a good connection by, for example, highlighting their work, listen to their needs in terms of data, give them privileged contact with data producers to get more information from them. And here is, as Julia said, it's very different from stakeholder to another. It's very hard to get information from a private company, for example. It's way easier from fellow colleagues within the public services. So here you know that a lot of reuse remain unknown, and sometimes it's just impossible to know the metrics of how many from some reuses. And I already said this, establish good relationships with important reusers and strive, yeah, to diversify profile, because I've noticed that we tend to find the easy way to stay within the community of people that are very involved in open data because of open data, that are motivated by what it means, and they do a special effort to share also their work, etc. So it's a small community and it's very strong in France, the open data community within a different organization. But I really think it's important that we also reach to other kind of stakeholders, such as private companies, for example, that doesn't have the same mentality of open data. It's just sometimes just a resource and that's it. So it's different communities, different way to discuss, but it's important to keep in mind that there are different stakeholders. So I need to have a sip of water. So the fourth level, and now it's getting very difficult to measure is externalities. What open data, what change open data brings to the world. And as mentioned, it can be good externalities, good impact, or bad impact. Example of such can be a scientific breakthrough, the political consequence of political data, for example, technological innovation, new usage brought by the publication of data. Here, it's very important, I think, to focus on very specific issue. For here, I give an example of the public transportation frequentation, efficiency of emergency services, uh, because we opened the national database, national address database, for example. So very specific use cases. Otherwise, it's very hard to measure. So this is very long and expensive to achieve. And here I think it's interesting what you said, Joanna, about how it's difficult to contract other people to to do the study, because I believe it's hard for us to do it ourselves, because it's very hard to get to adopt the very needed critical approach on the subject, because we obviously want to find impact and as much impact as possible, and we don't necessarily have, at least within our team, the research methodology to really adopt this critical approach, and we are more focused on like product delivery. So I think it was very interesting that that you mentioned that it's not easy to contract either. So in conclusion, I want to highlight that in this presentation, I try to focus on usage on each step of impact measurement. You have to look how data is used, and this can helps to open data according to demand, to learn what users need, can help us as data producers to prioritize the data quality or data quality, the what data set I need to open next, which really should not be an excuse not to open that, not to open what should be, because this is just the law and everything that should be open needs to be open. But when you prioritize your efforts, it's very important to focus on usage. I've mentioned that we learned, really did a study to learn why users share their work. And what we also did last year is to learn why data producers measure usage and how they measure usage. We try to assess their maturity over this issue on how we measure usage, and to understand what tool we can give them, what good practice we can share with the producers to measure usage. Um, what we try to do now is empower data producers with this issue of impact measurement, because they are in the best position given their knowledge of the data, and given that they can really establish a strong relationship with our reusers. It's basically the same strategy we had on opening data. At one time, we figured it's not possible to open data by ourselves, so we need to empower data producers of good practices on how they can get better data quality, or they can what are the different kind of licensing. So we try not to do most of the things ourselves, but empowering data producers. Now we want to empower them on a little bit further on the data life cycle, not merely just publish your data, but also measure usage, establish relationship with users, better off you data according to usage, etc. I have to say that according to our last study, the maturity of data producers in France is very different, I'll say, from one to another, and it's still very hard to get there yet. It's only a few data producers that really have this strategy of usage measurement, and most of the time it's more for internal reporting to and Vanity Metrics, I'll say, like how many downloads we had on our dataset, rather than really understanding usage. But some data producers are getting there more and more. I hope I've been a little bit clear and interesting. Sorry, my English is very rusty. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to answer your questions.
Thank you, Antonin. It was perfect. Thank you for sharing with us. I will also start resharing my screen, and we can, I will say, start with the panel discussion. I will give you the floor to my colleague, David Regexi, who will be the moderator for today. And we welcome back also Joanna and Antonin for discussing together. I see already some interesting questions popping up in the chat as well. David, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Julia. Hi, I'm David Regexi. I'll be moderating this discussion for the next half an hour, where I was thinking to myself, okay, how are we going to guide this conversation? Because we want this to be a conversation so that it's quite interesting and we can delve into some of the elements of the two presentations that we had. And when I was starting out, I was thinking, okay, the questions that we want to ask here are, why are we doing this in the first place? How are we doing it? But then it became really clear in Joanna's conversation, and then Antonin also picked it up, that who is conducting these analyses is actually something that is interesting to think about, and is something that I think we will end up discussing today. Julia in the beginning was talking about rules. I prefer guidelines rather than rules. There are no real rules here. If you do have additional questions, please pop them into the chat. I cannot guarantee you at all that I will get to all of the questions. We see that there are quite a number of them. Julia will be gathering them together and shooting them to me as we're having the conversation. I would say that if we don't get to your question, obviously one of the purposes here, this is a relatively tight community. We can introduce each other so that you can have offline chats, exchange a few emails, exchange some good practices. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do, is to learn how to conduct an impact assessment better. So this kind of brings me to the first question that at least I have. So I think we'll start with the how, and then we'll move on to who later on in the conversation. And it's something that came up, I saw in a few of the questions already, and it's about incentivizing people to give you information. There's a bit of an irony that we work in open data, but then we have a data problem at the end of the day, that we don't necessarily have the data that we need in order to conduct impact assessment, and we need to go out to collect it, and then we need to encourage people to do that. So my team conducts the team here at data.europa.eu conducts the open data maturity assessment. There's also this use case observatory, which has been mentioned a couple of times, where we needed to encourage SMEs and other organizations to give us information. And some of that information can be quite sensitive. How many users do you have? How much money do you make? Would be nice to know. a lot of information about impact is sensitive, and you need to encourage people to do it. So I know from our side, one of the ways that we encouraged people to participate is we just kind of annoyed them a little bit. So we would call them, and then we would call them again, and we would send them an email, and eventually somebody would come back to you. So this is what I want to open up with, and I will start with Joanna. So how do you encourage people to participate? I mean, you had 721, if I recall correctly from your presentation, of people who are participating in smart farming. How did you get them to answer the questions that you had?
Well, it was actually a good job that our contractor did. But the amount of interviews that had to be conducted in order to get 700 plus responses was twice as much. So just only one into calls result in filled-in survey. So it's not very encouraging. What we found out, because when we contacted person, and this person was were really prepared to talk to us. We rather didn't have problems to get the information we wanted, because we tried to not to ask for very sensitive data. We are not interested in the income of the entrepreneur of the company. We are not interested in the client base. But what was really difficult for us is to, well, even if we get a firm to talk to us, it was really difficult to find the right person. So the person who really can guarantee the credible response for us, the person who is really responsible for data issue in the company. So it was one thing, and other thing we were a little bit astonished to find a problem was that our respondents were baffled by the jargon used, so to say. So terminology was an issue, and well, the best approach we found was to prepare our interviewers to rely on or to operate on examples rather than on the lengthy explanation. So it was better to illustrate something with a well concrete usage case, or with some concrete data set that we are interested in, and to show it as an example, then explain it very lengthy. But still, this is the way that well, this is a thing that depends to a large extent on how well you can prepare the contractor, or how you can prepare the interviewers. It is on you, it is on the contractor, but at the end of the day, you have to be quite sure that the interviewers are proficient in the field that they are conducting the interview. So.
Mm-hmm. Can I, just as a follow-up, so you're specifically going out and conducting interviews rather than sending out a survey?
Yes. Yeah, that is more efficient. Yeah.
Anthony, do you have anything that you'd like to add in terms of?
Yes. I think it's a very interesting question. Well, to share our experience, what we did at a certain moment, we wanted to work a little bit more on reuses, and so we get someone in the team solely to contact people and tell them to reference their work on the platform. And by doing this, we learned that most of the time people just didn't know that it was possible to share their reuses on the platform. And when we contacted people that actually did share their work, it was mostly for the motivation. The motivation was being nice, because I like what you guys did. I like open data, so I want to share it to the community. So we stopped this enterprise of contacting people to share their work. for learning more on why they share and why they don't share. And most of the time it's just because they didn't know it existed. So we focused more on the product itself, on how we can give more visibility on these features, how we can give more visibility on the visits, for example, because we learned most people said, yeah, I published on the portal, but I'm pretty sure I'm getting no traffic from this. And because the national platform has a lot of traffic, when we highlight reuses, sometimes it can bring maybe 1 million, 2 million visitors to a certain product that we highlighted during the COVID-19 crisis, for example. And reusers were shocked that he actually gave them a lot of traffic. So, what I want to say here is that we learned that maybe we have to work on the product itself rather than only contacting people. Because when we contact people, most of the time it works. Because when you're being nice and you have give them the opportunity to get validation from a public authority, and you get opportunity to have visibility on Twitter or whatever. Most of the time they're happy to share if it's not most sensitive information. But it's very hard to scale this strategy because you have to look for users everywhere. You have to contact. It's very time consuming. So right now we try to focus more on the product itself and try to incentivize users to share their work by themselves. And we have another approach. We have a hybrid approach between reusers that are just published by whoever, and use cases that are really curated, that is someone in the team that really identify good use cases, contact people, measure the impact with them. It's more precise use cases.
It leads to the question, because especially when you talk about scaling and identifying reusers, and there's a question, for example, in the chat about sort of silent reusers, so those ones that you don't know about. I know from our perspective, especially with GDPR and sensitivity around data protection, it can sometimes be quite difficult to find out who is using the data and to reach out to them without doing quite a bit of research. So how are you identifying those individuals? Are you asking them to fill out a form with a checkbox that says, if you use our data, can you please let us know who you are? Do you have another approach, or are you going through this time-consuming process of sort of third-party research?
As far as we're concerned in France, we try to work really on incentives, and we don't have any you can just download and use data in the portal without having an account, for example. So we really rely on incentives, and we try to identify different communities. And when you get a contact within a certain communities, for example, one data journalist, you can meet other data journalists. This is a good example. For example, we have a lot of data journalists that share maps, for example, and those are actual reuses that you can share. But we noticed that some silent data journalists use open data only to prepare on-field investigation. Like, for example, you look at the evolution of tax prices within local tax prices, and this way you can send journalists to this city because this is where the tax increased the most. So this is kind of usage that you cannot share out the reuses. There is no map, there is nothing to visualize, there is nothing to share here. So this is a good example on why you want to be reachable to reusers and establish good contact with them, so that you can spend time to exchange on the usage. And this is something you'll never get on the platform. You only learn about those kind of things by spending time with reusers.
Yeah, if I may, I do share the point of view, Anton, because you have to combine all the methods available. We do not want to rely so much on the portal, because our idea is to make it as non-intrusive as possible. So we are rather afraid to ask too many questions about who you are, what do you do with our data, because it's not really our concern. Well, we do need information, but only if it's freely provided. So you have to be very careful here. But it's very worth your time to conduct so-called a search for enthusiasts, open data enthusiasts, and leaders who are very interested in the topic, because you can explore their network, so to speak. You can use the contacts that the person has, and expand your or client base, so to speak.
So this relates to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Anthony.
Yes, I completely agree. I think in product management in general, we want to rely a lot on KPI metrics, etc. But it's very important to have just spend time for informal discussion, when you don't really need to test out the features, but just listen out to the users. Most of the time, it's a very specific issue on a specific data set that you cannot help this issue because it's just out of your power, but you get a lot of information from just being available. So, for example, at one time we had with someone in the team that had an open slot. You had any question on the portal you want to discuss, share thing, you can take an appointment, 30 minutes, to just discuss whatever you want regarding open data. And those very informal discussion sometimes leads to learning different way of how people reuse open data.
Yeah, and this reflects on one of the questions that's been asked in the audience, because obviously you know, within sort of an understanding of what impact is being created, you have a formal process. And then, as you've been describing it, something that is a bit less formal, where you just want to have conversations and see what's happening. So do you ever go out in sort of an outreach type of way to conferences where these communities exist and engage in those kinds of informal discussions?
Sure, it is one of necessity to reach out to sector-specific groups of people. It is still well, time-consuming, and we really struggle to be everywhere when we are invited, but we try to diversify the efforts. So we utilize, so to speak, our open data officers, so the employees of ministries that we are operate more or work more closely with, and these persons are open data ambassadors, so to say, and that they can reach out more easily to the sectors that the ministry is responsible for.
Yes, I think it was more important before within our team to organize event was really a big thing, like to participate in hackathon, etc. It's getting more and more rare, but at least one or twice a year we take part in hackathon and events like this. I think it's very important, and it gives also some kind of pressure on data producers to open the data and try to be to publish good quality data, because a lot of people are looking at the same time. But just to share a thought, I think within those events you sometimes have the same kind of users. It's getting different, I guess, because now you have online conferences. But when you organize a hackathon in Paris on open data, you have the very diehard fan users, you know, the U-Power users. But those are people that are very important to you. But it's I think you have to also focus on the long trail, and not to. So what I want to say is that during those, we want to organize events to know different kind of communities, and not only to animate the very strong core open data community, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's a struggle. You normally speak to the well, you are already convinced in a way. But one way to widen your outreach is to quit being too formal. So we found out that even setting a stand with just one person, showing our portal or just chatting to people is quite useful. And the other way to reach out outside from the capital, which is also an issue here in Poland, is to engage local communities. So you have to prioritize to make local communities your priority group. And when you establish a solid base at the central level, you have your open data network of officers at the ministries and various important offices. You have to go below, so to speak, and cooperate with communities.
Yeah, I mean, it brings up an interesting point about sort of the difference between online and offline events and how that works for outreach. I mean, we can even see in this event today that at the end of the day, most of the people that are participating are limited to little chat windows, and it influences your ability to sort of engage with that community. So how do you see sort of working with online events, which allows you to kind of reach out further geographically speaking, versus the limitations that it creates in creating that engagement with your audience?
Well, we don't have so much very broad experience with online events. We do our conference, online yearly conference, annual conference, but well, sadly say it gathers mostly the people that we usually cooperate with. I'm not sure why, because well, maybe it's the formal thing, because it's well, it's a rather formal events with topics that are rather general in scope, and more policy oriented than practical. Well, I don't have a quite a specific idea what is not right with this kind of gathering.
Mhm.
I think you raised a good question that online event does not encourage informal discussion that are sometimes very important, but I've sadly no solution to that. I think online event also enables more people to participate, and sometimes people that just are curious and doesn't really want to get involved in a 2-day hackathon within the Senate, for example, that don't think they belong here. In an online event, it's easier to just have a peek and get to know the pros and cons, I guess.
Mhm. Okay, I see we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left until Julia virtually slaps me and tells me we have to stop. And I know we've had some comments coming in on the who question. So let's shift to who, because I think we can easily fill 8 minutes with who should be conducting an impact assessment. Yeah, it strikes me, as you say, that you have a couple of issues with who should do that impact assessment. On the one hand, you have the providers themselves, the open data portals that have the fundamental understanding of how things are working versus also the methodological understanding of how to conduct an impact assessment. At the same time, you also have an issue of who should be doing it in terms of conflicts of interest, right? Like if you're conducting your own impact assessment, then you're much more likely to say, yes, we've done a fantastic job here. So, well, I'll open this to either one of you, but so who has, let's maybe make it simple. Who has been, so we know that you've had individual contractors that are doing it, and I suppose then you yourselves have been doing it. Had been any other like an audit office, or have there been other organizations involved in looking at the impact of your work?
Well, a few years. Sorry, Anton.
Okay, thank you. Different answers. For like the first to third level, we do that ourselves. Like we monitor the metrics, we try to measure usage, the reuses, etc. We do interviews with use cases, etc. For the more in-depth impact on like the economical impact on the opening of one on another database, I think it's more the a research methodology. So we finance different association, non-profits, for example, the Open Data France Association and the FING, Fondation Internet Nouvelle Génération, that release study, but those are long-term study on impact, and those are independent non-profits, but still working on open data. So it's still hard for them, I guess, to say it's not working, we should stop opening data because it's in their political view, etc. So I'm really convinced. And another example of this was a political mission, which the prime minister asked one French deputy Eric Botorel to lead a mission on where we are now on the open data policy, and they did a very thorough impact study with the with different French deputy, so a parliamentary mission. I think the best people to do this are researchers, but I think it's hard to finance research because it's always create a a conflict of interest anyway. So I've noticed that the UACD or CDE, I don't always
OECD, yes, yeah.
OECD subsidize different theses on open data, for example. I think those institutions are very well placed. Maybe the European Commission as well is like international bodies, I think, can really have the good position to incentivize research study. I think at least in our department we don't have the real research methodology to like the academic research methodology to really lead those measurements. Sorry, was a long and messy answer.
It's a good answer. Joanna, would you like to also jump in?
We a couple of years back, we cooperated with NGO on a project referencing local authorities and how they use open data. It was okay while it lasted, because we found out that this kind of cooperation is rather incidental. It usually do not last very long, because NGOs tend to have projects financed for a certain amount of time, and then they lose interests, so to say. We once find a partner in the research institute to evaluate smart data in cities. And it was quite interesting, but still incidental. So at the end of the day, you have to rely on your resources and your expertise. And we are quite fortunate at the moment, because we have a sociologist on the team, and he is quite skillful in research, and he deals with our methodology and all the things research-wise that we are we might need. But what is important is not so much to conduct a survey, but to have a capacity to analyze the results and prepare the final reports with the recommendations and findings, and structure somehow the data you have gained. And this might be a struggle, because you don't usually have a person who is equally skillful and equally knowledgeable in all markets, all sectors, and all dimensions that you would like to know more about.
Yes, I think it's here you can see the difference of methodology and approach between research and project or product delivery. It's not the same timeline. Research project takes a lot of times where we have to deliver a product and run and get better every time. And research rarely give you strict answers. You know, it's more information on. It's hard to say it in English, but it is critical. So there is never in a proper research yes or no answers. There are difficult solutions, and it's hard to get from research direct implication on your daily work. And it takes time to process the information, say, okay, considering this, where we're going now, you know, because it's not a solution, you know, when a research paper, it's not it's not a company you ask them the solution, they give you a solution. If it's not a different way of working, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just looking at the time now, and I know our event is supposed to end at 11:30, and Julia is always, as they say in Dutch, precies op tijd. So I will thank you very much for the discussion. I know there are many, many more questions that are in the chat. I had many, many more questions, certainly about, I mean, even just this discussion about should an international organization be responsible for conducting the impact assessment? Normally when you have an international body, they develop a methodology that is supposed to be applicable across all sectors and across all geographies, and then it makes it very difficult to produce a methodology that is specific to the situation that you want to analyze. So it would have been nice to be able to talk about national versus local level analyses, but I must stop. I will pass the floor back to Julia. Joanna, thank you very much. Anthony, also thank you very much. Your English was perfect. It was very interesting discussion. Thank you very much. And back to you, Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Yeah, and thank you, Antonella and Johanna. It was very interesting. I do think, yes, that we are going towards the end. I see a very interesting question still there, also for you, Antonin, regarding KPIs, how you select them for the 4-step, especially the 3rd and 4th one. I see an interesting question about how also impact relates to high-value data sets. I think this might be a bit too long to answer right away, but I think we can also continue answering via chat following the event. So I would go on by asking you if you please can provide us with your feedback of today's session. Also maybe inserting further questions that you might have in the questionnaire. On the screen you see the QR that you can scan for the feedback form. I will also send maybe the link in the chat in case you wanna just click on a link.
For your information, I don't see the chat. I think if I don't use the Microsoft Team app, I'm just not able to see the chat. I don't know why. So,
okay. Yeah.
Maybe I'll share my screen just to give my contacts again if anyone wants to reach out.
Or
you have my email here. Yeah.
I would suggest that you can always send an email to academy@data.europa.eu, and we will definitely put you in contact. I don't know if our speakers have extra time to have a conversation, but once this event is over and we close everything down, then it would be an opportunity to stay behind for 5 minutes and have a very brief conversation. But definitely we would encourage you to, get into contact with each other. This is an interesting community, and sharing ideas is what we're here to do.
Exactly. So yes, maybe before the end, I would like to remind you to not miss our upcoming webinars. As mentioned before, we will have one on the Use Case Observatory on the 7th of October, and the second webinar for data providers on technical openness on the 21st of October. Also on the 20th of October, there will be the final event of the EU Datathon competition for this year. So you can also register for this. I will make sure again to share the links in the chat. These are further information to stay up to date with us, our newsletter and social media. I think we reached the end of our webinar. I thank you very much for being here and attending the webinar. I thank you our speakers, Antonella and Joanna, David for moderating, and all the team of data.europa.eu who is working on organizing these webinars. So Inma, for example, thank you. And have a nice afternoon.